In preparing for this project, I spent some time looking through past issues of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. To narrow the focus, I began with the year of my birth, 1964, then looked at other issues of the SCMS, focusing on 1972 and 2000 meetings, which I thought would provide a good range of contemporary research. One forum from 1964 which drew my attention was titled Pictorial Origins of Cinema Narratives: The Illusion of Movement and the Birth of the Scene in the Paleolithic Cave Wall Paintings of Lascaux, which was presented by Gerald Knoxon of Boston University. I studied poetry and literature in my early academic career, and these mythological themes have, touched and informed my studies for many years. As another writer, David Velleman, wrote in the Philosophical Review, any sequence of events, no matter how improbable, can provide material for storytelling if it completes a emotional cadence. Twins separated at birth are ideal protagonists for a story, even if the reunion is a fluke. A discovery due to serendipity, a tragedy narrowly averted by dumb luck, a mundane act that unforeseeably becomes a last in a life accidentally cut short. These are all the stuff not only of literary storytelling, but legend, gossip, and other forms of everyday narrative. In the 1972 Society for Cinema and Media Studies conference, I noticed a paper by Hubert Cohen titled The Horror, and Rosebud. I actually did a little research and was able to find that paper on JSTOR with the title slightly changed to The Heart of Darkness and Citizen Kane. Both these films present main characters who are facing a personal apocalypse, as does a similar paper in the 2000 program titled Apt Pupil and the Apocalyptic Discourse. The horror and the horror and science fiction genres give filmmakers and audience the freedom to blur the real and the imaginary, creating realities which only occur in nightmares or psychosis. As screenwriter Stephen Scheel wrote in an episode in a magazine called Talk House, it's true, horror is often provocative, transgressive, and challenging, but it's also, in my experience, a genre with a deep and intrinsic concern for examining some of the most fundamental themes of human experience. This serious discourse is often overlooked when discussing horror and thriller films, but it should be representative in the textual sources. Citizen Kane has been so decorated with honors that the film is often lost behind the applause, but it is a remarkable movie in its own right. Based loosely on the life of William Randolph Hearst, the film's documentary style is recognized by audiences, and Orson Welles' narrative draws us into the collapsing life of a media giant whose final words are heartbreaking even if their meaning is not understood or recognized by the documentarians. While not in the horror genre, it poignantly unfolds the realistic destruction of its main character. Apocalypse is often interpreted as a global event, usually cast as an ecological disaster, a military Armageddon, or a judgment ordained by God or the gods. Recent films have adapted global crises as apocalyptic narratives, ranging from Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the Andromeda Strain, The Planet of the Apes, and 12 Monkeys. While entertaining and dramatic, films representing the annihilation of humanity often provide more adrenaline and no pathos. The personal apocalypse films mentioned earlier carry a greater gravitas, with a single individual facing a personal apocalypse. Just as Neolithic humans sought dark caves to explore their own fate, so characters such as Marlowe and Charles Foster Kane cast shadows on our own self-awareness. Emotionally, as one writer said, emotionally charged aesthetic experiences such as Greek tragedy or horror films can shape somatic markers in the viewer. You cannot know for sure how you will face the kind of horrors portrayed by Euripides and Sophocles, and you can't predict your responses to a headless zombie, an alien facehugger, an approaching sea monster, or a chainsaw-wielding psycho. Hopefully, you're never going to be put to the test. David Tracy, Professor Emeritus of Catholic Studies at the University of Chicago Divinity Schools, explored the darkness in Joseph Conrad's novel. As he wrote, the narrator Marlowe makes a night journey trip up the Congo. In fact, Leopold II's Belgian colony was the most inhumane of all European colonies in its unspeakable treatment of colonized Africans. The following scene has become one of the most famous in a modern realistic novel, when the narrator Marlowe, after so long a journey through the dense jungles and often violent rapids in the river, meets his fellow white man, the dying colonizer, Mr. Kurtz. His final words express the moral truth he has found there. The horror, the horror. The film adaptation of The Heart of Darkness, Apocalypse Now, runs far afield from the novel. I don't think it's as strong as the novel itself, but I do think it carries some of the same mythological elements as as the text does. In recent years, several films have projected apocalyptic themes, some successfully, such as 2019's colorful Midsummer, directed by Ari Aster, and 2020's otherworldly I'm Thinking of Ending Things, directed by Charlie Kaufman. Some have been less successful, such as 2017's allegorical themed Mother, which is directed by Darren Aronofsky. The most successful recent adaptation of the personal apocalypse narrative was arguably 2018's Hereditary, also directed by Ari Aster. Toni Collette gave a strong performance as usual, along with it, and also had a strong supporting cast. None of the main characters are depicted as evil, and the family members are unwittingly driven to an unforeseen fate. Only in the final scenes does the horror of their fate come into focus as the son and the mother face their own violent conclusions. The film has gravitas once again and brings to mind other works like The Shining and Rosemary's Baby, where a family faces an unseen and destructive evil in their midst. Professor Tracy goes on to explore the horror which lies at the very heart of Christianity itself. He says the ultimate symbol of the religion is a cross memorializing a horror. Jesus of Nazareth crucified reveals for Christians both a crucified human being and a crucified God. Just as literature and film long ago adopted horror as a focus, Christianity is not the sole example of a religion which recognizes horror. As Tracy says, each of the religions, as well as many philosophies and theologies, offer penetrating portraits of possible responses to natural, historical, and personal horrors, often allied to some metaphysical portrait of horror. Clearly, the religion's philosophies cannot be ignored when addressing horrors and horror. However, the most powerful response to horror and horrors in Western culture has been the tragic vision first articulated by Homer and culminating in the classic tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Many critics and scholars have recognized a sudden shift in the tone and depth of horror films. Hereditary has joined a cadre of elevated genre films such as The Witch, The Descent, and The Babadook, which build on a heightened awareness and greater expression of psychological themes. David Church explores this heightened genre in his recent book, Post-Horror: Art, Genre, and Cultural Elevation. He grudgingly accepts the term post-horror as a stand-in for a number of descriptive titles such as slow horror, smart horror, indie horror, prestige horror, and elevated horror, each of which describes a similar phenomenon. Church celebrates the heightened genre while also recognizing its limited appeal. As he says, populist viewers regularly criticize the film's slow pacing, ambiguous endings, and lack of conventional monster thrills, deeming the film to be boring, confusing, not scary, and utterly unsatisfying. Indeed, the vast majority of negative criticism from general audiences hinges on precisely on the art cinema traits that these films display. Misleadingly genre-centric trailers have also been suggested as one reason for the disappointment. One hallmark of the new wave of prestige horrors is that the movies are often nothing like the trailers. Cutting together duplicitous trailers to bait a broader audience into seeing these very good movies seems like the best of a lot of bad options. The future seems bright for fans of horror. Post-horror proponents have readily adopted art horror films from the past centuries, and a list of these lost waifs include a long tradition of art horror cinema, which is now being transferred into post-horror cinema. Some of these films include The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Night Tide, Repulsion, Don't Look Now, The Tenant, Eraserhead, Possession, Funny Games, Pan's Labyrinth, Antichrist, and A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, and countless others. So, in the middle of a new resurgence in popular horror, there's a lot of room for new faces and new voices.